Hello, everybody. We are here with Paul Casey of Growing Forward. Hey, Paul, will you introduce yourself to the audience here so they can learn all the cool stuff you're doing?
Absolutely. Great to be with you, David. So my name is Paul Casey, and I'm not the golfer. There is a professional golfer named Paul Casey. I heard he's pretty good, but I'm just the duffer. And so I run a business called Growing Forward Services. I'm a solopreneur, and I do leadership coaching and training and team building. And I've got a little local podcast of my own.
Well, that's cool. And so, business, how is business up there? You're in like southeastern Washington. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, we're on the Spokane side of the mountain and down in the southeast corner called the Tri-Cities.
Wow. Sounds beautiful. Sounds beautiful. So, I noticed in your write up that you are like a time management guru. Is that right?
I do love the topic. Yes, I'm trying to brand. This is new this year as the calendar coach because it sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that sounds good. But do you spend too much time studying time? I mean, how does that work? How do you balance that? To become an expert, you're supposed to spend 10,000 hours. But if you're spending 10,000 hours, are you spending too much time? I mean,
That's a good point. Even when I teach the seminar on it, I say, okay, spend only about 20% tinkering with it, 80% actually doing this stuff. So I got to take my own advice.
okay, so you're working with clients and things. So what are some of like a story of a major breakthrough you've had with somebody? Because everybody struggles with time management.
Oh, they really do. Boy, so many different stories. There's the guy that has 7,000 undealt with emails, right? And it seems like I meet people that are like, I got 9,000. I'm like, we're not trying to set a record here, you know. But they're so buried on it that we have to come up with some strategies that, at some point you sort of have to go, all right, those need to be archived and we need to start fresh with some strategies, like checking email only on the hour. It was a mortgage guy, and so we had to say only check on the hour. If you have a client, obviously the client takes precedent over the email checking, and that's the only way you're going to keep up with it. So lots of stories like that.
I mean, that's got to be incredible to be that far behind where you got 7,000. So is that also a process of limiting the inflow? Where you guys did some assessment about what's really necessary and that type of thing?
Yeah, we've had to say, e-newsletters, other than Growing Forward Services e-newsletter, I would say, but e-newsletters, the ads, the CCs, having to actually have some words with people in their organization where I don't need to be looped in on all that stuff. That really narrowed it down. For my own self, I would go to lunch and come back and there'd be 35 emails after an hour. And I'd be like, this is ridiculous. And it happened day after day until I finally said, all right, let me examine what are these 35. And it was, 22 of them were e-newsletters and ads. And so once I started relentlessly unsubscribing from stuff, then it was like 11, and I was like, oh, I can deal with 11.
Yeah, that works. That works. So, what about just the general flow of time and how to manage the time? I mean, when you're working with a client, what do you find are the key things that you have to emphasize to them? Because our experience is that the more someone's involved, the more time someone's been in business, the more they're going to get pulled in this direction or that because they can add value in a lot of areas. So, where do you kind of dive in and help them filter?
Sure. I've come up with a little model called the fulcrum framework of focus. That's a lot of F words, but they're all positive ones.
That's right, not the
So it
bad one.
starts. Yeah, it comes from I went to a seminar years ago about a guy who was totally burned out. His organization had grown to multiple campuses, and he realized that he actually went to a monastery to chill out. And he had to unplug from his phone, give it to the monks literally in the monastery. And he actually went through withdrawals not being on his phone. He snuck out one night, he said. He actually drove away from the property. But he was teaching a seminar on avoiding burnout and what work-life balance really is. And it's not a thing. Work-life balance is impossible. If you were to achieve it, in 2 minutes later, you'd be out of balance again. So I prefer the topic work-life rhythm or work-life integration instead. So if you picture the fulcrum of a teeter-totter, and he drew this on his whiteboard, the fulcrum of a teeter-totter, and if you think about work on one side, life on the other, and if you were to just, instead of trying to balance the two, you take the fulcrum and you slide it to the left or to the right, depending on what is the need at the moment, based on your values and your vision. And so if sometimes, your parent might need to go into assisted living, or your child is you get the call from school, you got to pick up your kid from school, and you've got to shift that to the family side. Other times work has a big deadline. Your boss says, I got to have this by 5 o'clock, and you've got to shift the fulcrum that way. And I really like that a lot better. So when I made my little model, I put it in a triangle, like the fulcrum, and I start with everyone on manage your time around your values and your vision. That's sort of the base of it all.
Well, that sounds good. I mean, that's too many people get caught up in minutia or run around with stuff, and they're unable to live out the values and unable to pursue the vision.
Yeah,
So
and I think, yeah,
go
people want
ahead.
to get to the tips and tricks, right? They want to, like, hey, give me the little tips and tricks. And I'm like, no, we got to start with square one.
But square one's no fun.
No,
So
it's
so
not.
so what is square one when you're talking about that? I mean, here they have to have a vision. How can they pursue a vision? And they've got to have some clearly defined values. Do you work with them on that?
Yes, we really start there on all the different seminars. When I'm coaching someone one to one, I'll pull out the list of values, just any list will do off the internet, and I make them come up with their top core values. And they can check all the words that are totally them. They like achievement, success. Do they go, yes? All right, then check that one. If it's like beauty, and they go, not so much. So anything that they shrug on, they skip. So then they have like 25 wonderful words. Then I say, get it down to 10, and then get it down to 5. Then they start throwing stuff at me like, no, I can't throw out these wonderful words. I'm like, well, you're not throwing them out. We're just trying to eliminate what are your most important values that you couldn't be in a relationship that they didn't have those 5, or they didn't support those. You couldn't be at a job where they didn't support those 5 values. And those are the ones you'd almost die for because they're in your DNA. And everybody says, when I say those words and I link them to you, they're like, yep, that is so you. So we start out with those values. And then the second thing we do is I say, okay, so your life 1 year from now, I want you to just create a picture of that for me. How are your relationships? What's your work life look like? Just humming on all cylinders. So we sort of work from the back, and then we work forward, and then we come back from that. And we, based on those two things, then I say, all right, now how do we get to that? And then that's where the time management stuff can really be applied, because they've got the big why in their mind.
Well, that's one thing I'm really curious about. So if they've got these values, then how do they make certain, and what size organizations are you typically working with? Are you working with individuals, they're solopreneurs, or are you
Well, I
working
work,
with groups?
it's a variety. So I do have the entire range. Middle managers is probably my target market. So they're not the CEO, but they're also not the frontline employee. So I have some private clients that are stay-at-home moms to entrepreneurs to all different levels. And then I have companies where people, I literally coach some scientists. So I can't ever say this isn't rocket science because it literally is for them because we have a national laboratory nearby. So that's pretty funny to be able to say that. But it really is all sorts of the stuff works with any profession.
Okay, so here they've nailed down their values, and how do you focus their time around living those out?
Yeah, so you've probably heard of good old Stephen Covey, right? He was the one that did all sorts of stuff on time management, and the book First Things First came out, and you might have seen the quadrants, the 4 quadrants of urgent and important. You're familiar with that? The urgent,
Yes.
important quadrants, yeah. And so I pull that puppy out. I know it's tried and true back from the early '90s, I think, and I help them put things in those boxes in their specific profession. What is urgent and what is important, and then we really focus on box number 2, quadrant 2, which is the not urgent but important. Because when we do those things, it moves the needle further. And when you don't do those, after a while, it bites you. And so you've got to put those into your calendar first. Then I bring up the old example of the big rocks. And he brings that volunteer up on the stage, Stephen Covey does, and he says, all right, you got to get all this stuff into the jar. And so the gal pours in the water and the sand and the pebbles, and then she tries to get these three big rocks into the jar, and it's sticking out. She's like, "Is that good?" And he's like, "No, it all has to be underneath the lip." And she's like, "It's impossible." And he's like, "Think outside the paradigm." And then he says, "Put the big rocks in first." And so she puts one, two, and three, and it's just under the lip. And then she pours the pebbles in, and it filters to the bottom. Pours the sand in, it filters to the bottom. Pours the water in, and magically it all gets in there. And that's the illustration that I just run with people. And I say, you've got to get your quadrant two big rocks in your schedule first. So let's identify those. And it's amazing the snowball of productivity that happens once you do that.
So were you saying that, did I hear you correctly, that you said that quadrant two is the important but non-urgent?
Yes, sir.
So wouldn't the most important things be the ones that are important but urgent?
Well, oftentimes that's the reality of life, right? You've got the client in your face that's saying, "I'm not satisfied with this." Obviously, you're going to deal with that right away. But for the most part, I think that we are in control of our calendars, and if we're not, these are the clients that tell me I'm putting out fires all the time, Paul. And that's where I call time out and say, well, let's evaluate what those fires are. Why are you always putting out fires? Because that's exhausting. I mean, that feels like you're in reactive mode all day long. Now, granted, there are some jobs that are like that, but they accept that. But if you're a manager, a leader, I think you've got control of your calendar more than you think.
But those are the things that are urgent but less important, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you're getting caught up with that. But the what about the you said that the most important things are the things that are important but less urgent or not urgent.
Right.
And
No one
I'm
is,
wondering
yeah.
where so you're saying that's really your, although it's the number two, that's what's really most important versus what's important and urgent.
Yeah, maybe I should change the wording to say what's more significant in that quadrant, because those are the things that, like for instance, that would be professional development in there. Nobody is in your face going, "David, professionally developed today," right? I mean, it's sort of funny to think about that because no one's
Yeah.
yelling at you to do that, or write a thank you note today. No one's yelling at you to do that either. But relationship building and professional development, those are the kind of thing. Planning, budgeting are in this category. No one is saying you've got to do those right now, but if you do, it's going to move the ball forward and you're going to be way more prepared for the future if you do that. So maybe significance is a better word for that quadrant too.
Well, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like what's happening is the many important things that will connect people into doing meaningful work are getting put into the important but less urgent because you're busy doing stuff.
Yep.
You're busy doing the stuff that's screaming at you.
Yes.
And so that's what's messing you up. And you really have to recognize that those important things are in that other quadrant by looking at that.
Yeah.
So that's
Well
interesting.
said. Yeah. Well said. I think a lot of us live our lives in, we live out other people's scripts for us. Somebody even said email is everybody else's inbox or everybody else's to-do list that you have to respond to. And that's quadrant three, where these are meetings everybody else is calling. These are urgent tasks for someone else that they want to get checked off. And again, that feels disempowering to go through life always checking off everybody else's to-do list and not your own.
So am I understanding correctly? It sounds like you have them do these quadrants, but then basically you're helping them understand what's truth in the quadrants, because it sounds like maybe I missed it, but you're saying that what's in the important and urgent often is not important and urgent.
That's a good point. They have made it because you deem something urgent or not. It's like within your own power to deem something urgent or not. So yeah, it's like I'm in the balcony looking down at their dance floor. They're on the dance floor dancing all the time and not realizing, wow, I need to step back and do a self-assessment on that. Another tool I use for this, David, is a priority ranking tool where I'll have them write most of their tasks, well, at least 10 of them, 10 of their tasks on the left column. Then there's an important column, an urgent column, and then a total. And so what I do is I say on a scale of 1 to 10, and they say, well, it's client phone calls. And I'll say, okay, on client phone calls, how important is that for your success in your job on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being like, I'd be fired if I didn't do it. One being shrug, I got to get to it eventually. So rank that 1 to 10. Then I'll say, how urgent, how soon in the day do you have to get that done, or early in the week? 1 to 10 again. 10 is like, I got to get on this immediately. One is like, yeah, I can procrastinate for a while and get it done. Then you multiply those two together to get a total and you get a score. 10 times 10 would be 100. That would be your most important one. And then you've got all these numbers below that. Then I say, look, not every task that you have on your calendar is equally urgent and important. So re-rank them by the urgency and importance. And that's how you decide what to attack first in your day. Now, of course, a client isn't going to do that every day, right? That would be exhausting to go through that every day. But sometimes when people get overwhelmed, I'll pull that out again and I'll say, it's time to do the priority ranking.
Yeah, so you can do kind of a self check on that type of thing. Now, how much does this also play into it? Sounds like when you're talking about leadership development, or excuse me, employee development, that as you're working on the time management piece, you actually identify some gaps in their leadership skills or processes or systems that are going on.
Yeah, good point. Because what'll come out sometimes is like, wow, I haven't done a 1 to 1 with my direct reports in forever.
Eh.
And right. And I'll have to say, like, well, how important is it? Well, it's vital. Like, that's when I cast vision to them. That's when I find out what's on their plate, any obstacles I can remove. And I'll be like, well, that sounds like it is super important. So what percentage of your week are you spending on that? And they sort of hang their head and go, maybe 5%, when I think of it, but they always get bumped. And I'm like, wow, it sounds like it needs to be something that you need to keep sacred on the calendar, or at least move it around within a day, but you can't let it go for too long. So you're dead on with it. Reveals things that make them go, wow, this is crucial for my leadership.
So you mentioned that some people have these meetings that get bumped. So how do you make something quote unquote sacred in your calendar?
Well, it's one of the first tips I give after we get past that first foundation statement, which is make every one of your tasks into an appointment with yourself. Or as one author calls it, F bots, not F bombs, but F bots, focus blocks of time. And this is the thing that changed my productivity life, David. I was like, I looked at my to-do list and I went, this is my I don't want to do list. I would look down that thing and I'd be like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And I would pick the easiest thing just to feel productive and just to cross it off. Because when you cross off anything, you get this shot of dopamine, like, I crossed that off. And so what we do is we find these things that are easiest, but those big rocks, those quadrant two priorities are still sitting there, and they get procrastinated yet another day. So what I did is I make a an appointment with myself as if it was an appointment with another person. Because if I scheduled a coffee time with a prospective client or a friend, I would never blow that person off. I wouldn't go like, I'm just going to let them sit there and wonder where I am. I'd lose friends real quickly if I did that. But why do we do this to ourselves? Why don't we respect ourselves enough to honor that time? Like I said, keep it sacred so that we actually, when that time comes up, we actually do it.
But once again, I would say, how do you do that? I mean, so, I've got this time scheduled for myself, and, Jerry shows up at my door and says, "Hey, we got a fire. He needs to be put out," or somebody else comes in and says, "Hey, we got a prospective new client, we want you to meet with," or somebody else come, whatever. And that's just the door I'm talking about. It could be via email, via chat, by my phone, whatever.
Yeah. So, well, a lot of different answers to that. One, it obviously takes discipline, but one is people are always more important than tasks to me. And so if there is someone that says, Paul, I need a hand with this, or I got a quick question, I'm going to always put a person in front of a task. Now, we all have different personality styles. There are task driven people and more of the people driven. And so task driven people sometimes get a little irritated with the interruptions because it's like, I want to stay on track here. The people can squirrel away with all the interruptions, and they need tools for how to limit those distractions in their day.
Okay, but so but kind of what you're bringing up is if you're a people person, then you could potentially be more prone to being interrupted by people and not being able to get that sacred time that you need. So what do you do? What's the solution?
Yeah, so some companies, I try to encourage them to have some door rules. In other words, if the door is closed, and a lot of people love the open door policy. I think it's a good one. But oftentimes we have to get things done for other people that we're serving. And so I'll say closing your door is not an affront to the rest of your team. We have to do it sometimes to get stuff done for some of those team members and for some of our clients and customers. So it's okay to close your door once in a while. Then there's the door rule of being ajar, which is a knock, and you could say, "Is this a good time?" I say, "Don't say got a minute," because it's never a minute, of course. But is this a good time? And then the door completely open is a true open door policy where people can stroll in and just start talking. So with people persons, I'll say you've got to utilize the door rules first. Now, people sometimes again say like, "Man, that just goes against every grain in my being to do that." Then I'll say, put a sign on your door with a stop sign that says, please do not disturb for this period of time. Actually define it. And then say, I'm working on, actually tell them what you're working on. I'm working on the budget process that's due on Friday, and I will be available again and then put a time. So when the staff member comes strolling up and going, darn, he's not available. Oh, but I can come back at 1:05 and he'll be back at that time. So that's one strategy for helping with those people persons.
And what do you find as far as people respecting that, particularly if they're not used to those rules?
Yeah, oftentimes we have to have a team meeting in order to do that because if just one leader at an organization tries to do that, it often doesn't work. And I'll have clients that'll actually, if they have a window in their door, they'll say, as soon as I close my door, I actually get more people waving outside the door at me, like, "Oh, just 1 minute, or can you put your signature on just this one paper?" I just think it's pretty hilarious. So it has to be a culture thing for teams to honor that with one another.
Yeah, I had one gal who was HR and finance, and she had a glass office, glass wall, glass door, and she put a sign, just like you're saying, that she would not be available, and then she locked the door. And still she had people knocking or whatever, and she just pointed at the sign and then went back to her work. She wouldn't even talk to them. Which finally
Yeah,
they got the message, but I think it took a few weeks. It
yeah.
literally a few weeks.
And I'll even have to say also, sometimes you got to take your work to a different place, a different location, whether it's a
That's right.
coffee shop or you've got to hide somewhere that maybe only your assistant knows where you are in an emergency, but that's the only way you're going to get undisturbed time. Other clients, I'll say you've got to come in either early or you got to stay late and make that time sacred before the tsunami of email or the people lined up outside your door begins.
What about the thing that comes up with some of our clients is asking them to assess, if they're working on something important, they need this uninterrupted time, asking them to assess when they do their best work. Do you connect people there also as far as when you're going to schedule this time, figure out when you do your best work so you don't schedule a time and it's actually when you're drained and you're going to fall asleep or something, or it's
That's
not.
really good.
Yeah.
That's really good. I read a book this past year called The Power of When. I can't remember who the author is for it, but it's all about determining your chronotype. I never heard of the word chronotype before, but it's where you are at your best throughout the day. And there's four animals. There's the wolf, the bear, the dolphin, and the lion. So that's I think it's called the Power of When quiz.com, and it's a free quiz you could take with videos on it. And what it'll give you is what is your sweetest spot in the day based on your sleep style, so that you can put your most creative and critical thinking tasks in your sweetest spot in the day. Because if you don't, it's going to feel like sloshing, like you said. It's going to feel like it takes twice as long to get things done in your weakest sweet spot of the day. If you put it in your sweet spot, which for most people is like 10 to 12 a.m., it feels like you can hum through stuff much quicker. So don't stick a meeting in that spot. I'll say that in a seminar, and they all look at each other like, that's when our meeting is, to each other. And the boss is like, all right, you can see him taking notes like, all right, we got to move that to the afternoon, where that's a good time to put interactive stuff.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. So Paul, we've talked a lot about time management, and I know you also do the leadership thing. You're working with people of different size organizations. If you had to close this out and say, hey, the one takeaway, besides we want them to know how to get a hold of you, so that's a piece of it too. But one takeaway out of this is a tip where if you do this over the next week or month or whatever, you're going to see some improvement. What would it be?
I would probably say, well, I've already shared with you the calendar appointments with yourself, but I think the best one that has really changed many, many lives, and it's nothing new that you might not have heard from other time management speakers, but is to, before you leave work today, you do a daily preview on what are your top 3 priorities for tomorrow before you go home today. Because there's peace of mind, giving your day a hard stop, kicking you into work life rhythm mode. There is, your brain works on things while you sleep, your subconscious mind. So sometimes you get an idea in the shower in the morning, like, aha, probably because we have white space there in the shower. It's the only place we have that, but also because our brain works on problems when we sleep. And then you hit the ground running in the morning because you already know what your top priorities are. I even say, put just the 3 folders on your desk of those priorities and nothing else. And that's going to help you attack that. And then make sure those are blocked out on your calendar. So that's probably the best tip that I could give on time management.
Well, that's awesome. I would love to see, everyone in our audience try that. And Paul, how do people get a hold of you if they want to learn more about working with you or reading any of your stuff, attending some of your events, that type of thing?
Sure, it would be at paulcasey.org. That is my website. Growing Forward Services on Facebook, or Paul D. Casey on LinkedIn. But if you really, what I'd love to offer your listeners is a free Control My Calendar checklist. And it's going to kickstart you into this time management journey if you're like, I got to get a hold of this. So you would go to takebackmycalendar.com, takebackmycalendar.com, or you can text the word growing to 72,000, 7200. Text the word growing. I'd be happy to send that free to all the listeners.
Okay, that sounds great. Love to do it. Thanks, Paul, so much for being with us. And thanks, audience, for cluing in. I hope you all try Paul's tip. I think you'll see a big difference in your day.
Thanks, David.